having us this evening to provide some information about the issue of human trafficking. And I just wanted to make sure before I go too far, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. So my name is Maria Bush, and I'm the Anti-Human Trafficking Program Specialist at the Ohio Department of Public Safety, and we manage the Governor's Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force, which is a policy initiative that started back in 2012, and the point of our office is to build out a more coordinated response to human trafficking. And so part of that role is making sure that we are working closely with communities and coalitions and concerned citizens to raise awareness of the issue of human trafficking so that we can collectively improve our efforts to respond in an effective and meaningful way. And so tonight, our hope is to provide a baseline education for what human trafficking is and what it looks like in Ohio. And so Bree and I are going to share some pertinent information by one, explaining what human trafficking is, and two, Bree is going to offer some really helpful information on how you personally can get involved in this work. So let's see, perfect. So this is an overview of what we'll talk about. We will go through an understanding of human trafficking. So what is the federal definition and the state definition? What are some of the relevant statistics? We'll talk about what does human trafficking specifically look like in Ohio by talking about traffickers, potential victims, and running through some sample cases. We'll talk briefly about signs and indicators, and then again, Ohio's response and how to get involved. So understanding the crime. Human trafficking is a crime in which people profit from the control and exploitation of others. So this is pretty much just the most bare bones definition of human trafficking. It's a crime in which a trafficker is profiting by controlling and exploiting somebody else. And so that's often referred to as the compelled service of others for profit. And so a trafficker is compelling someone to do some service so that the trafficker can profit off of that service. And profit is really anything of value. Profit could be money or cash. Profit could also be drugs. It can also be rent. Those are different forms of profit that we've seen in Ohio, where a trafficker might compel the service of others for drugs. So it's really just anything of value. And the way that we define the word compelled is very specific in federal law and in state law. What does it mean for a trafficker to compel someone? In the US, the word compel is defined by a trafficker using elements of force, fraud, or coercion. So a trafficker then is using force, fraud, or coercion to compel someone to perform some kind of service so that the trafficker can profit. And we'll talk more about what each of those words mean. This is the AMP model. This is a really helpful breakdown of the federal definition of human trafficking. As part of the AMP model, there are three components that have to be present for a case to legally rise to the level of human trafficking. So in any trafficking case, there is an action and a means and a purpose. So in an action, there is a trafficker who is knowingly recruiting someone, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining any one of those action items by means of force, fraud, or coercion. So the trafficker is compelling that victim to do one of two purposes, either commercial sexual exploitation, so performing a commercial sex act, or forced labor. Oftentimes, a victim of human trafficking could be a victim of both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. If the person, the potential victim, was recruited, harbored, transported, provided by means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of providing both commercial sex acts and forced labor. But this AMP model is what helps us understand the two different types of human trafficking. There is sex trafficking and there is labor trafficking. Depending on who you ask, they may just be aware of one of them. But really in Ohio, we absolutely have both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, as well as in every other country in the world. There is a prevalence of both. And this table really helps answer some questions about what human trafficking is versus other crimes. When looking at this framework, it helps answer some of those tricky questions. For example, sometimes people might ask, what is the difference between prostitution and human trafficking, or prostitution and sex trafficking? Well, this answers that question. With prostitution, as we know, you have legally to consenting adults, and the person selling sex is doing so because that person wants to sell sex and they're doing so willingly. It is their choice. And then with sex trafficking, the person who is performing commercial sex acts is doing so because a third party has recruited that person, harbored, transported, provided, obtained by means of force, fraud, or coercion. And that is why that person is performing commercial sex acts, because somebody is compelling them to do so. And so anytime there's a case involving commercial sex or labor exploitation, it's always helpful to come back to this framework and ask the question, are all of these components present? And then this is a really helpful caveat to know about, which is under federal law, if we are talking about any minor under the age of 18 years old who was recruited, harbored, transported, provided, obtained for the purposes of providing commercial sex acts, then law enforcement does not need to prove that the victim was forced or that there was some element of fraud or that the victim was coerced to perform the commercial sex acts, because the minor cannot consent to sex, and so certainly they cannot consent to commercial sex. And so it's essentially the federal government's way of saying, we don't believe there is such a thing as child prostitution or a child prostitute. If there is a kiddo who is recruited for commercial sex, that person is a victim of crime and should be treated as a victim of crime under law. So what do force, fraud, and coercion look like? This is really critical because these are very difficult to identify. Each one of these elements is extremely difficult. And I think that there's a lot of public awareness campaigns and PSAs and posters and images that provide a really misleading picture of what human trafficking looks like. For example, one of the more obvious myth-like pictures is the picture we get in Taken, where a few American girls go to a foreign country and get kidnapped, and then forcefully transported and sold for sex in these different venues. We see kidnapping imagery a lot. For whatever reason, we see kidnapping imagery in PSAs. We see Facebook posts of, white vans sitting outside of Walmart ready to kidnap innocent girls and traffic them for sex. These are kind of the messages that we receive, but that is not at all what trafficking looks like traditionally in Ohio. That does not reflect accurately the cases that law enforcement investigates, because force, fraud, and coercion are just not that simple to identify. They're very challenging. And so we'll walk through each one. And so force, I think, is the most intuitive one, where a trafficker would use physical assault or sexual assault or confinement to compel somebody to perform commercial sex acts or forced labor. So for example, if you have somebody who is working on a farm and they are a foreign national from another country, and the employer knows that they can, pay them less than their other workers, and then the employee says, hey, I'm not getting paid fairly, so I quit. And then their boss, the employer, then physically assaults them and says, you can't leave this job. That would be an example of the trafficker using force to compel the labor of somebody who is working. And that person could still get paid and still be a victim of labor trafficking. The question is really, can that person freely leave that job without fear of force, fraud, or coercion? And the answer in that case would be no. But that's hard to identify because you and I aren't necessarily going to see that physical assault. If we're driving by a farm, we don't necessarily know if there are elements of force, fraud, or coercion, or if the workers are being abused in some way. Traffickers use force in a place where you and I may not see that, in order to control somebody and compel them to continue working so that the employer can then receive profit, whether that's free or cheap labor, or whether that is profit from somebody else providing commercial sex acts. And then fraud, again, really hard to identify. Fraud is an act of deception with criminal intent. And so we see this a lot with foreign national victims of human trafficking. We see this where a foreign national may get recruited from their home country with the promise of a very specific job in the US with these really good living conditions and working conditions, great pay. And then they may get a legitimate visa, travel to the United States legally, and then meet the employer. Employer says, hey, let me hold on to your documentation. It's not actually safe in the US for you to hold on to that. And then the employee who just gets there, there's this element of trust with your employer, and you're in a completely new country. They may hand over that documentation, their passport, their visa, whatever it is that they have as legal documentation. And then the employer can say, actually, you're going to be working in, let's say that person was told they would be a project manager. Then employer says, actually, you're going to be working in this restaurant. You're going to be working 7 days a week, 16 hours a day. And you can't tell anybody what's happening to you, because if you do, you're going to get deported because you're illegal. And then that person is stuck in this situation where they are working this job for free, because oftentimes the traffickers, when the victim goes and asks for their paycheck, the trafficker says, actually, you owe me thousands of dollars. It cost me this much to house you in the apartment next door. It cost me this much to feed you. It cost me this much to recruit you from your home country and get you to the United States. Trafficker makes interest rate whatever they want because it's all fraudulent anyway. And then this worker is in a situation where they are paying off a debt that they can never feasibly pay off. So that's indefinitely free labor for the trafficker. And they are too fearful of legal consequences, even though they have not broken any laws, too fearful of any legal consequences to reach out for help. And that's an example of fraud where, again, so hard to identify, because if I'm in a restaurant, it's going to be very difficult for me to discern whether or not employees are there because they want to be there and that's their job, or is somebody compelling them to work by withholding their documents and making up some debt that they have to pay off by working there. And then coercion. Again, so hard to identify. Coercion is just the threat of serious harm against any person or the threatened abuse of the legal process. Coercion doesn't require any physical force or harm at all. I've never personally spoken to a survivor of human trafficking that did not experience force or violence, but for a crime to just legally rise to the level of trafficking, all that is needed is a threat. So if a trafficker tells an adult woman, if you do not perform this commercial sex act and bring in this money, then I'm going to go to your parents' house and hurt your mother. That would be an example of human trafficking. That is a trafficker who is using a threat of serious harm against a loved one to compel her to perform commercial sex acts. And there was actually a pretty big federal case from a few years ago where there was an adult woman and an adult man. And the adult man was this woman's drug dealer, and she was addicted to heroin. And so he was feeding that heroin addiction. But he would only give her heroin if she met a certain quota of performing commercial sex acts. And there were certain text messages exchanged where she would ask for heroin and he would say, no, not until you bring in this much money. And to a jury or a judge, that sounds a lot like two people doing illegal activities. And it sounds like a woman who is, one, using heroin, which is illegal, and two, prostituting to get heroin, which is illegal. However, in that federal case, they were actually able to prove that she was a victim of human trafficking, because when you are addicted to heroin and you are withdrawing, it literally feels like you're dying. And so a trafficker using that withholding of heroin so that she would have such severe harmful withdrawal symptoms was actually legally considered to be coercion. It was a threat of serious harm against her to compel her to perform commercial sex acts. And they were able to convict him on trafficking charges without her even having to testify in court, because she was in no position to do so because of the drug addiction and the trauma of just the trafficking situation. They just had to show text messages back and forth, and that was enough for them to say this is a case of human trafficking. But again, that woman may not look to you and me like a victim of human trafficking, or if we met her, if we saw what looked like street-based prostitution in some part of town. But when we look a little bit deeper and further into the situation that she's in, we're able to see that she is being compelled by a third party and isn't even making money off of the commercial sex. That is really to profit the trafficker. So we could go on and on about what force, fraud, and coercion look like, and that's why I have a few case examples moving forward, but this is just a baseline definition of human trafficking to help us contextualize the rest of the content. So, nature and scope of human trafficking. So in terms of data, the International Labor Organization estimates that there's about 24.8 million victims of human trafficking in the world, with the vast majority of them being victims of labor trafficking, and then an estimated 4.8 million victims of sex trafficking. And labor trafficking, this is something that happens in many diverse work venues. There's a picture here of mining, there's agriculture, domestic service, hospitality, construction, all kinds of different venues. And then sex trafficking is really anytime there is that element of commercial sex. So that could be prostitution. It could also be pornography and other forms of commercial sex provision. So this is some more national data. So speaking specifically about the United States, you may have heard that Ohio has the 5th worst human trafficking problem in the country. That is a bit misleading. When people say that, they are getting their information from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. This hotline is a catch-all for receiving human trafficking tips from concerned citizens, from law enforcement, from survivors themselves, and they've been operating for a long time, over 10 years, and pretty much almost every state promotes the National Hotline to report tips. So they are a really good source of data, and for the last few years, Ohio has reported the 5th highest number of human trafficking cases to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So these aren't just phone calls and they're not just unsubstantiated tips. These are calls that turned into actual cases as the National Hotline would define a case. And so Ohio placed the 5th highest after California, Texas, Florida, and New York. This says a few things. Number one, it says Ohio absolutely has a human trafficking problem because we have tips to show for it. We have identified victims to show for it. But what it also says is that Ohioans are very aware of the National Hotline, and they are calling the National Hotline more frequently when compared to other states. And when you actually standardize this data by population, it puts Ohio at 8, not at 5. But essentially, I think this mainly says good job, Ohio, for being aware and for reporting human trafficking case information. I think if all states were equally aware and equally concerned and equally aware of the National Hotline and how to report cases of trafficking, I think numbers would even out. Because if there is a demand for commercial sex in an area, there is going to be sex trafficking. And there is demand for commercial sex. If there is demand for cheap or free labor, there is going to be a labor trafficking problem. And so we know that it exists in every state across the country. And so there isn't necessarily the data to justify that Ohio has a worse problem. But I do think it justifies the statement of good job, Ohioans, for reporting trafficking when you see it, which ended up being more frequently comparatively. And then the bulk of the reported cases in Ohio are sex trafficking cases. So those are cases involving illicit massage businesses and resident-based commercial sex. And then 44 of them were labor trafficking cases, with the majority being domestic work and then agriculture. What are we missing? I know this slide doesn't make a ton of sense because I'm conflating that international statistic with a national statistic. However, according to the International Labor Organization, 80% of trafficking is labor trafficking. And in the US, labor trafficking cases only account for about 11% of cases that go to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So I do think, so it's possible that we don't have as much labor trafficking in the US, but I also think that it's more likely that we are under-identifying labor trafficking. And I think that we are because labor trafficking largely happens in legitimate work venues. Sex trafficking kind of automatically opens the door to some kind of questioning or investigation because prostitution is illegal. There's been, obviously continuing conversations on the effects of pornography. These aren't necessarily fully legitimate businesses in the eyes of the public. However, if we're talking about domestic service or a traveling sales crew, people who go door to door and knock and try and sell magazines or candy, if we're talking about restaurants, healthcare, agriculture, construction, these are legitimate work venues where someone could be a victim of trafficking and you and I may not ever identify that. And so in my view, I do believe that there's an under-identification just because of the nature of the work that they're doing. This is a bit of a tangent, but I did just want to touch on the difference between smuggling and human trafficking because they get conflated quite a bit just in general. So they are different crimes, but one can turn into the other. So smuggling is a crime against the US border. It's transportation-based and voluntary. So individuals choose to be smuggled from their home country into the US to evade immigration authorities. Trafficking is a crime against a person. It doesn't require any crossing of a border, and it really doesn't require transportation at all. Based on that AMP model, somebody could be harbored by means of force to perform forced labor within the confines of a home without even traveling down the street. That person could end up being a victim of labor trafficking or sex trafficking. So in that way, they're very different. Trafficking is exploitation based and involuntary. So victims are coerced or abused. They are not. No one ever wants to be a victim of human trafficking. The tricky thing is that smuggling can turn into trafficking, and so some victims may originally agree to be smuggled into the US, and then because they are undocumented, there is that risk factor of an employer to exploit them and not pay them and threaten them with all kinds of harm if they try to leave their job. So they could easily turn into a victim of human trafficking, but on their faces, the crimes are different. So human trafficking in Ohio, what does this look like? So who are traffickers specifically? This list is just a quick list of what trafficking or what traffickers have looked like in Ohio. And the point of this slide is just to say there is no profile for a trafficker. Traffickers have been identified as pimps, parents and guardians, which is a really sad connection to the drug problem we have in Ohio, caregivers, businesses, domestic employers, seasonal farm employers, men and women. Plenty of women have been convicted of trafficking in Ohio, and gangs. So it's really anybody using force, fraud, or coercion to exploit another person for profit. And I highlight this Columbus Dispatch story just because no one would have necessarily suspected that a Dayton roofing company owner would have pled guilty to federal charges of labor trafficking for paying his part of his work crew less and exploiting them for cheaper labor. The point of this slide is to say there is no demographic for a victim of human trafficking either. At least not a racial or gender demographic. Victims of human trafficking can be adults and minors, domestic and foreign national, any race, socioeconomic background. There is no demographic profile for a victim. However, trafficking disproportionately affects vulnerable people. And so that is the common denominator when we're talking about vulnerabilities to victimization. And vulnerabilities hit on all kinds of demographics. And these are a few key vulnerabilities that I wanted to linger on. One is foreign nationals, which we've talked about. There is that vulnerability of if they come here legally and the employer takes their documentation, they're not familiar with their rights, there could be a language barrier. Or if they are undocumented, again, the employer could exploit the fact that they are undocumented by not paying them or paying them less than is legally required and then threatening them so that they can continue to use free or cheap labor. And then runaway and homeless youth. I can't overstate how vulnerable this population is. So kiddos who are running away are probably running away from something. They're probably running away from sexual abuse in the home, physical abuse, neglect. These are kids with a lot of unmet needs, unmet physical needs, emotional needs. And these are the people that traffickers specifically look for. Again, there are so many PSAs or images of random teens being kidnapped in unsuspecting locations by complete strangers and then immediately sold for sex. That is not what law enforcement has identified over the course of however many years of doing trafficking investigations. What they find is that traffickers look very specifically for that very vulnerable youth who has run away from home because they know they have experienced abuse, they know they have experienced neglect. They come alongside them and they know that they can meet every need that that kid has. If you have that 14-year-old girl who just ran away from home, who doesn't have support in her home, and this older, attractive guy pulls up next to her and tells her that she's really pretty and that she has a really nice smile, that is going to fill so many voids that she has. That is going to meet so many emotional needs. He's also probably going to meet physical needs. He's going to give her food, shelter. He'll say that she can live with him. He'll buy her nice clothes and treat her like she's never been treated before. And that will build a very strong and trusting relationship very quickly. And that is exactly what traffickers are trying to do. Oftentimes, it becomes a romantic relationship where the trafficker will knowingly kind of pursue this at-risk or runaway, sometimes girl. I'm using kind of a girl pronouns as an example. Sex trafficking can occur to boys and girls, but first, for the sake of my example, that's why I'm using the pronoun she. Where he is building this romantic relationship with her, promising her the moon, promising her marriage and children and a dog and a house and their future. And then, one day he might say, hey, I spent all of my money on you this month and I don't have enough money to pay rent. So if you could just sleep with this one guy this one time, it would help us out so much financially. I'm really sorry to ask, but we really need that to pay rent this month. And at that point, she might say yes because of the relationship dynamics and not wanting to upset her boyfriend, or she might say absolutely not, I'm not doing that. In which case, oftentimes he can become very violent and use all kinds of force, sexual assault, rape, physical violence to compel her to perform commercial sex acts, to the point where that is what she's continually doing day in and day out. Because again, the unfortunate reality is that there is a demand for commercial sex, and so it is lucrative, and traffickers make a lot of money by trafficking individuals, children, adults, for sex. And so there is a very strong trauma bond that develops, because in this victim's eyes, this guy is her boyfriend. He's the only person who loves her and cares about her, and that is how she is perceiving this relationship while he makes a ton of money. Again, she wasn't kidnapped, because if she were kidnapped, at the first chance she would probably try and run away. She would probably try and report what's happening to her to law enforcement. She would call her family. She would do anything to get out of the situation. But when you have a runaway and homeless kid who doesn't have that support from home, who thinks that her trafficker loves her, who she has a strong trauma bond with, she is not necessarily inclined to report. Number one, because of a trauma bond and not wanting to necessarily be separated from the only person who she thinks supports her and is there for her. And two, there could be a ton of fear from the physical assault that she might experience by reaching out for help. So there's all kinds of physical violence that is compelling her to continue. And there's also that relational dynamic there. Oftentimes, even with domestic violence cases, you hear people say, well, why doesn't she just leave? And we hear this with trafficking cases too, because that runaway or homeless kid, could they technically walk out of a door and report what's happening to them to law enforcement? Could they physically do that? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes that is a possibility. However, we know now from the federal definition of human trafficking that confinement is not the only way that a trafficker might exploit somebody. Again, there could be fraud. There could be the threat. He might say, if you tell somebody, I am going to seriously hurt you. And that would rise to the level of human trafficking. So again, it's hard to identify. It doesn't look like kidnapping, but it looks like this very intentional recruitment of people who have vulnerabilities, largely runaway and homeless youth.
Hey, Maria.
And then individuals with drug addictions is another. Yes.
Yeah, we have a question that I just wanted to fit in real quick.
Absolutely, go for it.
Are these kinds of children the ones who are being found recently with Operation Not Forgotten, finding 39 missing children? Were they the vulnerable among us, the at-risk, or the runaway? Are they reported missing and then found?
Right. So that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't know the details of each of the cases or each of the missing kids who were identified. All I know is that a significant percentage of the missing kids that were identified were very likely victims of human trafficking. So there is that big overlap there, which was they were definitely missing, and a percent were victims of sex trafficking. So I would say there is that overlap. The specific details on what each of those kids had experienced prior to being identified, I unfortunately don't know the details, since it was a largely federal operation, and typically those details aren't necessarily disclosed. So hopefully that answers the question a little bit. But I would venture to say that because they were missing children, there were certainly some of those underlying vulnerabilities there, whether that was a kid who ran away from home because of abuse, or maybe there's drug use in the home, all kinds of reasons that would cause a kid to end up being missing, probably contribute to a vulnerability in some way. Does that answer that question?
I think so. Yeah, I think
Okay.
we can move
And
forward.
if there are follow-up questions on that, please feel free to, yeah, just mention it again, or if there's any others that come into the chat, feel free. I'm happy to answer those, because I do think this is a really important piece, is knowing who we're looking for and who is vulnerable. So thanks for the question. And then individuals with drug addiction. So like I mentioned, a trafficker may intentionally recruit someone who they know has a drug addiction, because they know that if they can feed that drug addiction, then they can control that victim. So very much like that federal case that I mentioned before, trafficker knew she's addicted to heroin, and if I can continue to provide it, she is going to do whatever I ask, including providing commercial sex acts, which he can then profit off of. And traffickers may also create a drug addiction, especially with minors. So if there's a minor who had not been using drugs, a trafficker may introduce that as part of the exploitation. With adults, they may just seek out somebody who already is struggling with a drug addiction. But that is a big vulnerability there. And vast majority, at least in Central Ohio, of the adult victims of trafficking that are identified do have a drug addiction. So there's a very large overlap. And I did want to mention one side note, is that when we talk about prostitution versus sex trafficking, the Franklin County Municipal Court did a study where they screened all the women picked up on prostitution-related charges to see whether or not she fell under the federal definition of a victim of human trafficking, and 92% of them fell under the federal definition of human trafficking, which is a very big number. And I think, again, it speaks to the reality that trafficking victims are not necessarily who we first suspect or who we first think. Women arrested for prostitution do not necessarily look like trafficking victims, which, again, is why they were arrested for prostitution. But now we're able to see, oh, man, they display all those vulnerabilities. The vast majority of them were sexually abused as a kiddo. Many of them were involved in the juvenile justice or foster care system. Many of them struggling with a drug addiction. Those are the victims of human trafficking that we are seeing. And then individuals with developmental disabilities, which I'll touch on a sample case, history of sexual abuse. So these are just a brief list of vulnerabilities that I think are really critical to understand, so that we get a sense of who is victimized. So I'm going to run through a few sample cases of labor trafficking and then sex trafficking, just to show how diverse these cases are in Ohio. So this is an example of labor trafficking from about, I think, 2015. In this case, adults and minors were recruited from Guatemala, and the adults were told that they would have these awesome jobs in the US, that they would have these great wages and pursue the American dream. The kids were told that they would be brought to the US, and then that they could go to school and then eventually graduate and go to an American university, and also pursue the American dream. So what happens is everyone pays a fee to the recruiters, and the adults are smuggled into the US, so illegally smuggled, and then the kids are told to cross the border as unaccompanied minors, because they knew that federal policy was to apprehend unaccompanied minors and then place them with placements in the states, foster placements. So all of this happened. The kids crossed the border, the adults are smuggled into Central Ohio. The traffickers submitted falsified documents to the federal government, and then the federal government released the exact kids into the custody of the traffickers in Central Ohio, which is a huge mistake on the part of the federal government. There was a big Senate investigation into what happened there. So you can learn, if you Google this case, there's all kinds of stuff you can read. There's also a Frontline documentary episode specifically on this case. So if you're interested in learning more, there's all kinds of content out there. But once the traffickers had the minors and the adults in Central Ohio, they forced them to live in these dilapidated trailers with no running water and fecal bacteria. And then they would transport them every day to and from the trailers to chicken farms, where they were all forced to DB chickens and vaccinate chickens and do this very hard in unsafe labor, meaning they didn't have the safety precautions in place for the workers. And the kids were not going to school, and the traffickers were taking a big chunk of their pay out of their paychecks. And the traffickers told the adults and the kids, if you tell anyone what's happening to you, we're going to kill your families, which is a very real threat in general, but especially real threat when you know that there's already a power dynamic in Guatemala. One of the kids' families actually couldn't afford the fee, and they really wanted their kid to have the opportunity to go. And so they gave claim of their land over to the trafficker. And so there's all kinds of power dynamics at play. And so the adults and the kids were terrified for their lives and for the lives of their families. So they were working day in and day out on these egg farms until one day one of the boys called his uncle, who lived in Florida, and told his uncle what was happening to them. And his uncle reported it to law enforcement, and law enforcement called the National Human Trafficking Hotline, who called the Department of Justice, who called the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Northern District, and they opened up a big investigation, and a whole bunch of folks have been convicted on trafficking charges or being part of this trafficking ring to date, which is great. So there have been a lot of convictions and justice in this case, and victims connected to services and immigration relief. But this is an example, again, of labor trafficking in Ohio that would have been really hard to identify. And in this case, it was not a third party who identified it, but one of the victims who was able to access help and be really brave and find out how to contact his uncle. An example of sex trafficking. So this is an example from Toledo in which a man had met a minor on social media. And the girl who he had met had run away from home. So there's that vulnerability piece. She ran away from home. And then he ended up meeting up with her and then taking her to a home, to a different little spot in Toledo. And then he essentially took photos of her, posted them online, and was offering commercial sex with her in the Toledo area, which is just an awful example of what that can look like. So again, vulnerable kid who had run away from home, was using social media. He, I don't know all the details of the case, but likely saw those vulnerabilities through social media, built enough of a relationship with her that she was willing to meet up with him. And then she ended up being forced to perform commercial sex acts. And she was very clear with the trafficker that she was under the age of 18 years old. And this trafficker, was sentenced to 35 years on sex trafficking charges. This is an example from Warren County. So I wanted to, just show the diversity of regions. So that's one Toledo case. I have a case from Cincinnati, and then this case is from Warren County, from Avondale, where a man faced charges. I haven't seen if there was a conviction or sentencing yet. Charges of sex trafficking, rape, and other related charges. And that is for forcing two adult women to perform commercial sex acts by using violence and isolation, again, providing them with drugs. And what he had done was similarly took photos of them, posted them online, and advertised commercial sex with these women. And the commercial sex acts were taking place in these hotels in the suburbs. These are hotels that we pass every day going to work or driving to the food store or whatever. I remember there was a similar case in Blue Ash in the Cincinnati area, because I grew up in the Cincinnati area. And I remember seeing this case in the news of all of these women who were trafficked in this specific hotel that was right at the exit that I would always get off at. And these are right in our communities, because again, there's demand for commercial sex everywhere. And where there is demand, there is going to be a sex trafficking problem. And you can Google more about this case. I know that there was an interview where they interview one of the victims. I didn't want to put that in here. It's a tough interview to watch. And she said she wanted her story to be known. She wanted to share it so that people are aware that this is happening right next door in their communities. But it's hard to watch. And, I'm not sure if it was a good time to do an interview. But if you want to learn more specifically about this Warren County case, you can Google the facts of the case and learn more. But she does, share what the abuse was like, and that she was abused with the phone cord. He would hit her. The trafficker would hit her with the phone cord. He would burn one of them with the butt of a cigarette or a pipe. Just really awful violence. And I hate going through the details of these. I think it's critical to understand the trauma and the violence and the way that victims are compelled into this, and why, again, it is hard to leave a situation, and just the trauma that is experienced as a result of trafficking. So this is a case from Warren County. Again, I haven't seen the conviction yet because it is more of a recent case. So sex trafficking in Ohio. So this is an example of trafficking within an illicit massage business. We see these all across the country. So this isn't just Ohio. This is many, many states where we're becoming more aware of these businesses that look like they are just a massage business, but they're actually offering commercial sex acts. And these are largely in more affluent neighborhoods where people have kind of that expendable income to just pull over before or after work to pay for a commercial sex act. And in this specific case, 18 Chinese women were living in the massage parlor and forced to perform commercial sex acts in addition to providing massage. And in this case, it was two sisters, actually, so two women who were charged with promoting prostitution, money laundering, and practicing medicine without a license. And so it wasn't trafficking charges, again, because it's so hard to prove. Elements of forced fraud or coercion, but especially difficult when you're dealing with all Chinese women, none of whom speak English. Even when you have interpreters, there's still such a cultural barrier to getting to the bottom of the facts of a case. So not a trafficking charge, but for all intents and purposes, this was what we would view as a case of human trafficking, in which Chinese women who are from impoverished areas of China are recruited on the promises of this great job, and then they end up in a situation where they are compelled or forced to perform commercial sex acts. And again, this was in Delaware, Ohio, so just north of Columbus, in a more suburban area. This is another just really awful and sad example of sex trafficking. This is from Hamilton County, where a mom was addicted to heroin and essentially, legally speaking, trafficked her 11-year-old daughter, sex trafficked her 11-year-old daughter so that mom could get heroin as a form of profit. So again, in this case, that is commercial sex act, and the profit being drugs, which is just a devastating impact we see of the drug problem, where if there's a parent who is addicted in her situation, even the strongest instinct a parent has to protect her kid was overwhelmed by a drug addiction. And so this mom was convicted on trafficking charges, then sentenced to 51 years to life in prison for trafficking her child. So signs and indicators, again, I apologize just for how heavy those cases are and how heavy the content is, but there is hope. There have been a lot of victims identified, and it is because people are diligent to be equipped with the signs and indicators and the knowledge of what to look for, so that we can be helpful to our communities and we can actually intervene on behalf of those who may be experiencing trafficking. And so I'm going to run through these quickly. Again, the most important thing to know is just what is human trafficking, because signs and indicators, there isn't a perfect checklist for what to look for, that once you see these three things, you know it's trafficking. But I think understanding the dynamics of the crime and understanding the vulnerabilities and risk factors is the most helpful. However, I do think it's helpful to just kind of get a sense of what some of these indicators are. So common work and living conditions. Is the person living and working on site? Do they live and work in the same place? That could be an indicator of labor trafficking. Are they not free to leave or come as they wish? Kind of getting a sense of control there, someone controlling their movement. Are they under the age of 18 and providing commercial sex acts? So in that instance, that pretty much would be your check mark of victim of human trafficking. Is unpaid, paid very little, or paid only through tips. That's not necessarily an indicator in and of itself. There is labor exploitation, which is different. Labor exploitation means that person is, their employer's not abiding by, labor laws. Maybe they're not getting paid, minimum wage or what have you. The difference is if they are able to leave and quit their job without fear of harm, if no one's forcing them to work or there's no coercion or fraud, then that's labor exploitation, not labor trafficking. Labor trafficking occurs when the trafficker is using force, fraud, or coercion to compel their labor. Work excessively long hours, not allowed breaks. Again, they're not treated well at work. Those are all big red flags. Owes a large debt that they're unable to pay off to their employer. Again, that is what we refer to as debt bondage under federal law, and that is often used by traffickers in labor trafficking and sex trafficking schemes so that they have free labor indefinitely until they pay off this debt that they cannot pay off. Was recruited under false promises concerning the nature and conditions of their work. High securities in their work or living conditions to keep people within the confines of that location. You may notice poor mental health or abnormal behavior. So the victim may appear fearful or anxious, depressed, submissive, tense. They could be unusually fearful after bringing up law enforcement because, again, they are fearful of harm from their trafficker or fearful of being separated from their trafficker. And so law enforcement is often not where that victim is looking to go for many reasons, largely out of fear. They may have been told you're illegal or you're doing something illegal, or if you report, I'm going to do, X, Y, or Z to you or your family. So there is just a lot of fear around the idea of reporting to law enforcement. They may avoid eye contact, probably lacks health care, dental care. Again, these are people who are largely under the control of a trafficker. That's kind of the nature of trafficking, is they're being compelled. And so they're not necessarily getting, great care. Oftentimes victims do end up in an emergency room situation, which is a whole nother conversation. So if there are healthcare professionals here, we can obviously talk more about that during the question and answer or at a follow-up session on Thursday. But they also may appear malnourished, show signs of physical and or sexual abuse, physical restraint, confinement. Again, they may lack control because, again, trafficking is about control. Traffickers use control. They may have few or no personal possessions, may not be in control of their own money, financial records, or bank account, their identification documents, not allowed to speak for themselves. We see this a lot where if they're in a situation like in a healthcare setting or at a BMV or the bank, that the trafficker will speak on behalf of that victim and kind of monopolize or control that conversation. Lack of clarity and awareness. So the victim may claim to just be visiting. They may have a lack of knowledge about their whereabouts and not know what city they're in, especially if they have been transported, and if there's a drug component there. Loss of sense of time, inconsistencies in stories. So these are just a list, not a perfect foolproof list, but some guidance that the National Human Trafficking Hotline put out to help equip communities and citizens to know what to look for. So I feel like we probably get this point that there are a lot of challenges to identifying victims for a lot of reasons. The nature of the crime is that it's hidden. So like many of the sample cases we talked about, those are hard to identify. The egg farm case, hard to identify. We're not necessarily seeing the threats. We're not seeing the physical abuse. We're not seeing the money getting taken out of paychecks. It's a hidden crime. These are people who are transported to and from work each day. The sex trafficking cases, hidden crime. This is, what looks like a romantic relationship, what might look like to the victim's friends, like, this girl's boyfriend who's just bad news. When in reality, it's a lot more than that, where there is commercial sex that is occurring, but there is just a hidden nature to it. The abuse is hidden, the violence is hidden. Victims often do not self-identify. So again, that's why screening tools never say, are you a victim of human trafficking, to see if they are, because they would never self-identify. I won't say never, I'm sorry. Most often, victims do not self-identify as a victim for all kinds of reasons. One, they may not view themselves as a victim at all. They may just view it as, I got myself in this situation, or this person is my boyfriend and loves me. I just have to get through this for a period of time before we can get married and have a house, because that's what he keeps promising. They may not self-identify because they feel honor bound to pay off the debt. They may not self-identify because their trafficker told them they're going to get deported or arrested or thrown in jail if they do. So all kinds of reasons why they don't. And again, that's why traffickers traffic the people they do, is because there are vulnerabilities that keep that person from self-identifying as a victim. Traffickers coach victims through threats and violence. So we've touched on that quite a bit. that victims do not run to report because they are being threatened or they are experiencing a lot of harm. They are fearful of harm to themselves and their families. Again, if there is that element of coercion, there's a lot of threatening that is occurring. Shame, there's a lot of shame for even just the stigma of commercial sex, of prostitution. There's shame in coming to the United States to provide for your family, and now you're in this situation where you have nothing and you're being told you owe $50,000. So there's an element of shame that could keep someone from self-identifying. Mistrust of authorities. They may feel honor bound to pay off those debts that I mentioned. Trauma bond, like I mentioned, they might be in love with their trafficker and not want to report for that reason. I'll always remember this training that I went to that was provided by a member of the Cleveland Human Trafficking Task Force, and it was an FBI special agent, and he was sharing about the first sting operation he had done, where they had done the back end investigation, and they were about to do a bust on a very violent pimp who was trafficking an underage girl for sex. And it was an awful situation. The details of the case were awful. So he was expecting to go in, do this sting at the hotel, and that the victim would run into his arms and say, "Thank you so much for saving me from the situation." And he said when he got to the scene and separated from her from her trafficker and took her cell phone for evidence, he said he had never heard such a string of profanity thrown at him because she was so angry that he was separating her from her trafficker. And when you know the details of the case and you know what she has been through, that is not at all what you would expect. But that is the reality of what a trauma bond does to the brain. In fact, the same chemicals that get released in the brain that cause a traumatic bond are actually some of the same chemicals that a woman experiences while and after giving birth. So these are strong chemical bonds. And there's one adult survivor that we work with. She provides a lot of training and advocacy today, but she has gone through a ton, and she has gone through a long healing journey after her trafficking situation. And in a training that she gave recently, she said that if she heard her trafficker's voice today, you would have to pin her back to a wall to keep her from going back. And she said, "I know that sounds crazy, and I know in my current mental and emotional state that that's wrong and that's misguided, but I'm just telling you what the emotions feel like when I think about my trafficker, or if I were to hear his voice today." And we hear this many times by women with that lived experience. So again, I can't overstate that trauma bond because it's so contrary to what we would intuitively assume is true when doing a operation or when trying to assist a victim. Trauma bonds make it really difficult in our efforts to do that. Lack of understanding by the community of human trafficking. Again, if we are looking for people who are kidnapped, or if we're looking for kind of a more taken oriented view of trafficking, we are really missing what it looks like. And PSAs and some viral Facebook posts, they just paint a very different picture of what it really looks like. And I think that lack of understanding can then also cause big challenges to identification, because then we are not looking for the runaway kid who is smoking weed and skipping school. We may actually put them in juvie. They might be facing juvenile court. We aren't necessarily looking for the woman who is addicted to heroin who is prostituting on the street, because we view her as, again, a prostitute who's using drugs, who needs to go to jail. And so when we look for this different picture of trafficking, we are missing the actual victims of human trafficking. And language barriers. So again, when dealing with foreign nationals, that can be a challenge to identification. And so I wanted to give you this National Human Trafficking Hotline number. I would recommend that you put it in your phone, that you memorize it. It's pretty easy to memorize. So it's 888-3737-888. So if you suspect a victim of human trafficking, or you suspect a potential case of human trafficking, you can call this number or text Be Free and provide some details. And that national hotline number triages to the appropriate local responder in your area. So if you call from your region, they have a referral directory where they will contact the most appropriate local person to respond if that is what is necessary as part of that case. So I would highly encourage you to use that as a resource. They have many different languages available as well. Or if you're in a situation where you suspect you're engaging with someone and you suspect they might be a victim of trafficking, but they don't necessarily want help, you could always, very discreetly provide them with this national hotline number and say, if you ever need help, feel free to call this phone number. Because oftentimes you may be engaging with someone who is not wanting help right in that moment. So use this as a resource and use this as a tool. Or obviously, if you suspect immediate danger, call 911. And then join your local trafficking coalition, which Bree will share about in a few moments about what that actually looks like. Briefly, I wanted to share just about Ohio's response context, just so there's an awareness of generally what does the response look like in our state. So in Ohio, we have a lot of grassroots advocacy and victim services efforts. We have law enforcement task forces. So there's a law enforcement task force in Central Ohio, in Toledo, in Cuyahoga County, Mahoning County. And then Southwest Ohio does have a human trafficking law enforcement working group. It's not necessarily a formal task force, but there are resources and contacts in the Cincinnati area for reporting tips and who do investigations. We have the federal laws, of course, and then state laws. So I didn't touch as much on the state level human trafficking laws within Ohio, but they were built to mirror the federal law, and they're very similar. So for the purpose of time, I'm not going to dive into those laws, but of course, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. And then state agency initiatives. So again, our office manages the governor's human trafficking task force, which is comprised of state agencies who were initially charged with using their resources to build a more coordinated response to trafficking. And so we work closely with cabinet agencies on policy. So for example, we work with Job and Family Services to make sure that caseworkers are trained on human trafficking and that communities have service providers who are funded to serve victims of human trafficking. We work with Medicaid to make sure that trafficking victims are eligible for Medicaid reimbursable services. We work with the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction and Department of Youth Services to make sure that all individuals who are screened into a state prison or juvenile correctional facility are screened for indicators of human trafficking so they can be connected to services. So there's all kinds of state level work that is occurring. And so to learn more, if you're interested in more of the policy end, you can go to humantrafficking.ohio.gov to learn more. Our website also has a whole bunch of resources. We have additional training videos. We have reports that you can read. We have Ohio level data that you can sift through. And we have this map of human trafficking coalitions. And so Ohio is home to over 20 trafficking coalitions, and these are comprised of different key stakeholders in different regions that come together in a coordinated way to respond to human trafficking. And since I'm assuming everyone who's listening tonight is from the Deerfield Township area, I am going to turn it over to Bree to share more specifically about what that region, what your region's coalition efforts look like. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Bree.
Before Bree gets in, I just want to thank you, Maria, for that very informative thing. And just remind everybody, if you do have questions, you can utilize the chat function to go ahead and submit those. We will also be reconvening again on Thursday to do a more comprehensive Q&A session. And but thank you again. I know this is a very heavy subject, and there's a lot of information here, and we do appreciate the questions to make sure that we're informing the community as best as possible about this. And with that, Bree, I'm making you the presenter so you can take over from here.
Okay. We're actually, can you go back to having Maria be the presenter? She has the rest of my slides.
Oh
yeah, I can click through for Bree.
Yeah.
Yes, we should be good now.
Perfect. Got it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm Bree Combs, and I am the Regional Coalition Specialist with End Slavery Cincinnati. Maria, do you want to go to the slide? Next one. Yep. Thank you. So we are the Southwest Ohio response to human trafficking, and we serve all victims of human trafficking regardless of their sex, their sexuality, their age, nationality, beliefs, or the type of trafficking. We were founded in 2007 as a rescue and restore coalition, and then we joined forces with the Salvation Army in 2012. The Salvation Army is now our fiscal agent. Our coalition covers 9 different counties in Southwest Ohio: Hamilton County, Butler County, Warren County, Highland County, Clinton, Claremont, Adams, Brown, and Scioto. So we cover really wide spans. And then we have 2 sides of our coalition. So the first is our direct care. Well, it says here, to increase victim identification through the provision of community education and awareness about human trafficking. So that side of it is the coalition side of it, which I manage. And that is the public education and awareness, the legislation and policy, and then also just working with coalition partners throughout those 9 different counties. And then the second half of our coalition is the direct services piece, where we are coordinating services for victims that are identified in our area. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Some services that we provide are our own 24/7 hotline. You can call or text this number. This is specifically for Southwest Ohio. So if you would like to also write down that number, that is directly to End Slavery Cincinnati. But either hotline that you have memorized or in your phone is perfect. So if you've already got the other one memorized, that's fine. If you want to memorize this one, that is cool too. And this hotline, you can call with tips. You can call. This is also like a client line, so they don't have the direct number to any specific case manager. When they need something, they call this hotline or they text this hotline, and that's how they connect with their case manager. We also provide crisis response. So this is the first initial call, or when a client calls in and they are in crisis mode, they need immediate services. We connect them with medical care, law enforcement. We have a food pantry. We have a shelter, just anything that they need to get through the day and care for those immediate needs we can help with. And then after that, we have a comprehensive case management protocol where they're linked up with a case manager, and they are able to kind of go through the process however slowly, however temporarily they want to do that. A lot of times we get people who kind of ebb and flow with that. So somebody they might come to us addicted to drugs, and they go through a detox period, and then they relapse, and we don't hear from them for a few months, and then they come back, and we continue the process with them. So that might happen often with someone. They might be with us for a few months up to a few years. It just depends really on their recovery process, and we are very open to taking people in as they are, and caring for them in their current situation. Then as far as our coalition goes, it's considered best practice, in our opinion, to have a coalition of partners. So whereas we're not providing every single need that they have, we're not providing for their medical, their law, their their shelter, their job skills. We're not providing for all of those things under one roof. We're coordinating, we're collaborating with our community and in each of those different counties that we work with to work with our partners, because we know that we cannot excel at everything. We can excel at what we're good at, but we also really need to partner with our community so that we can provide that most comprehensive care for each individual that we serve. So we might refer out to Legal Aid Society of Greater Cincinnati for financial assistance, housing assistance, counseling, addiction recovery, job skills, like I said. And then we also provide support groups for victims that are identified. Okay, next slide. So there are a lot of different ways that concerned citizens can get involved. First of all, the 24/7 hotline that I mentioned earlier. You can always call that with any tips, any situations that you would like to report. you can join our monthly coalition meetings. They are on the third Thursday of each month at 3 p.m. And right now, all of our meetings are on Zoom. So we're not meeting in person like we normally do. And honestly, I don't know how long it's going to be. So even when we do go back to in person, we may still offer that option, which would be really helpful because we do span that 9-county area. So for people that want to participate but don't want to drive an hour each way, that's been really nice. So then we also have our Legislation and Policy Committee. And with that committee, we focus on obviously legislation and policy. We talk about what legislation is in the works. We talk about what we might want to advocate for as a committee. We work on different projects that might include like educational handouts about different legislation that's in the works and why it's needed and how it's going to affect victims of human trafficking. And then we have our Public Education and Awareness Committee. And with that committee, we focus on addressing sometimes like headline news or social media stories that are being passed around. I know with the Save Our Children, there's been a lot of myths and things that we've kind of needed to address. So that committee is very on top of that and has a lot of awesome people that have great ideas on how to address that and just kind of get the word out and dispel some of those myths. I think a lot of times those headlines are very fear-inducing, and so just kind of setting the record straight, you know, that this is not something that we need to fear. It's something that we need to be aware of, but it's not something that we need to fear on a daily basis that is going to affect us. But as much as we're educated and aware of the issue, that's half the battle right there. As far as the Public Education and Awareness Committee, they also work on creating toolkits for social media, for news reporting, articles in newspapers, that kind of thing. They also highlight different campaigns depending on like what month it is. If they are focusing on LGBTQ, if they're focusing on domestic violence. So we just kind of take different campaigns one at a time and really focus on those in regards to human trafficking. Then we also have a law enforcement human trafficking work group of Southwest Ohio, and that is any law enforcement officials or agents that want to get together and talk about various cases in the works or best strategies, best practice, investigations that they're currently working on, victims that have been identified that they just kind of want to present to the group and kind of talk through the process of that person's recovery and what to do from there. And then we would love to have you as a volunteer or an intern or as a fellow. We have lots of opportunities for that. You can, as a volunteer or as just a member of your community, like this has been put together, you can attend or coordinate an education and awareness event just like this. If you have a church or a school or like a mom's group or whatever group that might be interested in hearing more about human trafficking and what you can do in your community, we would be happy to coordinate with you a training like this. And then also we have our website and we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Maria, if you want to go to the next slide, we have all of our contact information there for Maria and I, and then also our websites. And then, so I know that this was a lot of information and it takes some time to kind of process through what you've heard, especially with the deeper things, the heavier things. It just takes time to iron all of that out in our heads. So we wanted to give you some time to think about what we've presented tonight, come up with your questions, and then if you would like to send those questions or your thoughts or topics that you would like to discuss to us ahead of time, you're more than welcome to do that. Just send it to our ESC Outreach Gmail account, and we will compile a list and address all of those on Thursday. If you don't send those to us in an email, you're more than welcome to bring them up during that session on Thursday. But if you have any immediate questions or thoughts that you just want to share now, please feel free. Otherwise, we will definitely discuss all of this more on Thursday.
That was awesome. Thank you, Bree.
Yeah, thank you.
So Jim, I don't know if you want to just let us know if there's questions in the chat box and we can stick around for a bit just, if people think of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I did also want to give Trustee Heading an opportunity to say a few words at this time. So Trustee Heading, if you'd like to unmute yourself and reach out, talk to the group, you're more than welcome to. Trustee Heading, it looks like you're unmuted, but we cannot hear you if you're speaking. Let's see.
I'm trying to speak.
There
Can you
we
hear
go.
me now?
Yes.
Oh, so sorry about that, you guys. Computer issues. You would think after this many months of working from home, there should not be one excuse for a computer issue. So my apologies. I was just saying thank you so much for taking your time tonight to come out and educate us and to really help us understand that there's ways we can get involved as a community. And if you don't mind us sharing this last slide with all of your information and asking for questions that we could work through on Thursday, that would be really helpful just to kind of see what's out there, because it's a lot to take in right now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Please feel free to share that.
Yep,
But
agreed.
thank you so much for your time. We've been talking about this since pre-COVID. So I just am so grateful you took the, you took the bull by the horns when we called you and said, can we do this? So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us and for leading through raising awareness in the region. I think that's critical to starting to respond. So thank you too.
Absolutely.
With that said, I do not see any questions coming through. So we'll hold that until Thursday. And thank you again to Maria and Bree for your time tonight and, of course, your time on Thursday. And I look forward to hearing this discussion move forward.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you all
Thank
for
you
joining.
so much.
Thank you. All right. Take care.